Well, welcome to Psychology to Live By, and today is a Q&A with some very delightful people, and our topic is the imposter syndrome and being better than perfect. Our participants have watched two imposter syndrome podcasts, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary now before we jump into our Q&A. It's always been a bit of a puzzle for me. Is perfectionism a good or a bad thing? And somewhat predictably, it turns out to be both. And in the podcast, we examine the nature of perfectionism, both good and bad. At the heart of unhealthy perfectionism is unrealistic standards and goals, and a really unhealthy focus on self. Unless something's 100% perfect, it's perceived as a failure. And there's always some implicit audience waiting to judge us negatively. But there are many high performers who rightly attribute their success to their perfectionism. And they don't display the typical negative emotional, physical, and psychological features of unhealthy perfectionism. Now, to understand this, we examined Elizabeth Lombardo's distinction between perfectionistic strivings and perfectionistic concerns. We saw that the imposter syndrome is found in people who are high on perfectionistic concerns. And then we examined how the punitive logic of such concerns plays out in everyday life. We then turned our attention to how we can convert these concerns into strivings so we can be better than perfect. And being better than perfect means not being as much driven by fear of social judgment. It's not about improving self, but improving knowledge and skills. We then looked at 3 ways to become better than perfect. Converting our thoughts from concerns to strivings, setting more realistic and achievable goals, and talking to trusted others about our perfectionistic concerns so they can help us recalibrate our unrealistic beliefs and standards. Righto, so now to our Q&A. And here we have the aforementioned delightful people. And I'm very interested to hear your insights and questions in relation to those podcasts. Who would like to start?
Can start. I don't mind.
Fantastic.
I find this topic really fascinating in the context of I have 2 teenage daughters who are, like most teenagers, caught up in social media. So what I see in their experience is really the perfectionistic concerns and what they're looking at, and this unrealistic version of perfection that they're trying to achieve. So in thinking about the younger generation like Gen Z and converting those perfectionistic concerns to striving, what kind of how can I best help them achieve that, or like what tools can I use to help them get to that place?
You know, Karen, if I nail this one, you and I can make a fortune.
Let's do it.
Yeah. But in fact, there's quite a lot of empirical evidence that exactly that cohort, teenage girls, are the ones who suffer the most from these impossible standards that are portrayed on social media. So but obviously that pertains to all people, especially people who spend a fair bit of time on that, because, as you know well, the images portrayed on social media, and indeed on the internet in general, they're highly curated. They're not everyday life. They're not really the way people are. And so, but we can watch that sort of stuff 24/7, and so it distorts our view of what's normal. And just generally, the internet's a wonderful thing, but we can watch extraordinary things 24/7 where people are the best in the world at things, and everything looks so easy and effortless. And so this creates that terrible gap that I spoke about in the podcast, this ego trap where one feels compelled to portray that I'm like those people on social media, but internally I know I'm not. And it's that gap that creates this terrible feeling of insecurity and being an imposter. All right, so that's the problem. And I believe your question was, what's the solution?
Yeah. So what is the solution?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I guess if we talk in general principles, I think the first is a subtle one. It's helping your daughters with their language. You know, if you notice in their language that it's all about overgeneralizations and extremes and impossible standards, you know, they might say I'm hopeless, or I'm you know, or I'm, you know, or they might say something the opposite at the end. I'm the best. And it's actually helping them calibrate that to something that's closer to reality, right? And again, you would have seen, and we'll probably talk more about this, you know, collectively, but you would have seen that the language of perfectionistic concerns is focused on how I'm going to look to others. But the language of strivings is focused on the task. That was really good. How could you improve that bit, right? And encouraging, you know, these young women to measure themselves more and more against themselves. So that's one big piece. Another piece is helping them actually build perfectionistic strivings in the sense of taking on achievable goals, achieving them, resetting the bar, achieving that, resetting the bar, achieving it. So it's a sort of iterative process. There's a notion of a thing called marginal gains. This is not very exciting for teenagers. They want to have a 50% improvement, right, overnight. But if you can get them, if you can validate and praise very small increases in whatever domain, whether it's their school performance or, you know, the way they're dressing themselves, or, you know, whatever is important to them. It's the 1%ers that if you keep drawing their attention to it, that they're getting better, they're getting better, they're getting better. It's that process of skill and knowledge development that you want to reinforce, not they are the best or they're perfect. The third thing is kind of implicit in this conversation, and that is the imposter syndrome is a horrible thing in that it captures people in a very lonely space. They largely keep it secret, right? So on the outside, they're pretending to be better than they are, but on the inside, they're suffering, you know, 1,000 deaths. And this is where them being able to talk to trusted others, people whose judgment they trust, who can recalibrate their expectations. I think I mentioned in one of the podcasts, one of the privileges of doing therapeutic work is people tell you what's actually going on the inside. Yeah. And quite often, you know, very, very highly conscientious, quite sensitive people will have the imposter syndrome. We might talk about personality a bit later, but they'll frequently, they'll say something like, I know this sounds ridiculous, but, and it's the act of talking to another person. Very often your kids will recalibrate themselves. But when these things roll around in your head, they have a certain sort of absolute verity or truth to them, or it feels like that. But when you say it to someone else, it can liberate you from that sort of very lonely prison. All right. So it's not a neat parceled, take this pill and it's, but there's a number of things to be chipping away at with them. But that's a fantastic question. I don't think I don't think we're going to make our millions out of the answer yet, though.
Yeah, but it's a great start. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. What else, guys?
I think Karen, oh, sorry, Terry, go ahead.
Please. No, go ahead.
Well, I think, following up from what Karen said, I think with girls in particular, I think balance is really important, but it also, as they get older, and then you start to have those feelings when you're in a career, when you're trying to be the best at your job, and then suddenly you have to be the best mother and the best wife or the best father, the best, balancing all of that and finding that balance of, something has to give. So, that balance is very difficult to find. And when you have that automatic or that need to be a perfectionist, I think that's incredibly difficult.
Yeah. It is difficult, and I think there are two themes that you're talking about there. One has to do with it's a gender thing, being a woman, which of course I know very little about, and the other is personality, and I might jump to the personality one first, and that is that perfectionism is strongly correlated to people who are like genetically predisposed in the sense of they're highly, highly conscientious, right? And so the highly conscientious person, they're going to worry a fair bit, because they can perceive all the things that could go wrong, all the things that aren't quite right. And so control is often an issue. They want to be able to get it right. And then everyone will be safe. Everything will be okay and I can relax. And then if you add to that another personality dimension, which is it's often called stability or emotional stability. If a person's more sensitive, it's going to amplify that. If they also then happen to be another dimension, more agreeable, they'll want people to like them and they want people to be happy around them. And it turns out women on average are somewhat more agreeable than men. Not a lot, not as much as you might imagine, but it plays out. And then you have this sociological thing about women. We won't go into the history of the women's movement, but there's pressure on women to do, as you say, to do it all. The one thing I would say about all of that is that when we're very high on conscientiousness and very high on agreeableness, our perceptions of what's reality are somewhat distorted. This is true on any personality dimensions if we're at really high or low ends. And so it's reminding yourself that it doesn't have to be perfect, that what might be better than perfect is what's actually required in the task, right? And reminding yourself that your needs are super important, right? It's not all about keeping other people happy. And so that can help you, close that perfectionistic gap so that you can relax a bit more into doing a better than perfect job, which is what's actually requisite. Right. But we could spin out on that one for a while, but we've got three other people here and time's flying by. So, but thanks for that. That's great. Great question. I've only got two others, haven't we? Sorry. Yeah.
So Dr. Chris, coming at this from a completely different angle. In the workplace.
Yes.
I like my team not to be perfect. I actually like them to be wrong. I like them to discuss possibilities that may be completely off base. But inside that, there's learnings through a collective conversation around it. Someone's just thought that they think is weird might be picked up in different perceptions from others, leading down a rabbit hole that ends up with a hypothesis that might end up being true. So how does one encourage that in a society, especially when the team's talking to the boss, to the CEO? How do I encourage them not to be perfect, but to be really comfortable in being wrong?
Yeah. Again, if we bottle this one, we'll make another fortune.
I know. I need to bottle this one.
But let's just go back to the heart of this. And the heart of perfectionistic concerns is fear of negative social judgment. All right, so it's fear of, and the way we're designed, when there's any fear of, when self comes into our consciousness, when self-concern or self-worry comes into our consciousness, it basically hijacks our brain in the service of self-defense, right? Some people call it the amygdala hijack, but whatever that was called, as soon as self-concern enters in that way, creativity is heading out the door, right? Because the person's just in survival mode. And so the longer answer is creating a climate of what psychologists call psychological safety. Yeah. And this climate of psychological safety is one where people, all the groundwork's been done, that it's what preceded it, and that is that people feel known, they feel respected, trusted, so that there's just less risk when they speak up. Now, so people feel freer to just be themselves like they would be with their mates. Now, that's always a work in progress. You get a new person into the team, they've got to learn that it's safe. And they can only learn by being rewarded when they do venture something a bit wacky or a little bit just off the top of their head. So you've got to teach them gradually that this is a safe place. And it's a bit like, dog training in that if you want a dog to sit, you wait till it does something that looks a bit like sitting and you give it a dog biscuit. So if you want people to venture, when they half venture, you tell it, you zero in on it with positive feedback, but also very specific feedback. That's a terrific idea because, or I love the way you ventured there because. So you're giving them what Professor Carol Dweck from Stanford would call growth mindset feedback. It's based not on, oh, you're a legend, but on what they did and why it was useful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So kind of riffing off of this, I'm somebody who I think I score pretty high on the striving side, but also at times high on the, the self-concern side of perfectionism, but that modulates depending on the environment or the circumstance that I might find myself in, where sometimes I don't, so am I thinking about that the right way? Is that true that like different environments or situations might yield a different level of perfectionism on either spectrum?
Definitely. And it is, as you say, you're riffing off what Terry said, because one way of thinking about this is at the core of all of us is a construction called self. Right, and that's universal, and our life, as it were, is about promoting the interests of this thing called self, or this construction called self, more accurately. And so, whenever it's threatened, if the environment is such that I don't feel safe, that's going to trigger, more likely trigger concerns, because they're about self-concern and worry about what people think and so on, right? And safety. So yes, because you'll know that in certain environments with certain people, you're just really freed up, right? So, but having said that, different people will have a different ratio of these concerns to strivings just generally, or they'll carry it across more environments. And even if you create a psychologically safe environment, some people are still going to clam up, because they're really scoring really highly on perfectionistic concerns. Yeah, but no, your intuition is correct, absolutely. And my intuition, by the way, is that about 20 minutes has already passed. So I think not to stretch our audience's patience. Obviously, we could go a lot deeper and a lot longer on this, but I think that's been a fantastic discussion. And And thank you so much for watching the videos and for your very, very thoughtful and insightful questions. Okay, guys, I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.